Get 5 coffins ready.
Kuang is a mage in SMITE, but is pretty much only ever seen in a jungle role taking on an assassin playstyle. Kuang is an interesting case, because there's times where you need to use every last brain cell to execute flawless combos and breakneck escapes, but other times you just kinda hold the basic attack button. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, builds. With Kuang there are 2 playstyles, attack speed or burst. Really whichever build is better, just depends on which playstyle you like more, although the attack speed build is typically more foolproof, especially considering how easy it is to get behind on Ao. For me, burst feels a lot better, but others feel like he doesn't do damage outside of attack speed builds, so I say either is fine because the only time it wasn't up for debate was when he first came out. Then magical attack speed items were pretty terrible for a while, then a few years ago they became totally fine, and I have my doubts about us going back to the Dark Ages, where only one build is viable anytime soon. Hybrid Kuang isn't awful either, but that one is definitely pushing it. Relics wise, you typically want to spring for the Blink and Beads combo, the relic you start with depending on the matchup. Kuang is pretty awful early, so while he doesn't feel great without Blink, I can't really blame you for falling back on beads in most situations. Especially lately, with all these warrior jungles, which Ao is terrible into, by the way. So, Ao is pretty fragile, but with plenty of strengths of his own. Let's start off with one of the more basic parts of his kit, his passive. Kuang starts the match with 0 stacks of his passive. He recharges passive stacks every 12 seconds, regardless of whether or not he's in combat. Every time he hits an enemy god with a non-ultimate ability, once per ability cast, Kuang is healed for 5% of his maximum health, and the ability cast has its cooldown reduced by 2 seconds. So this means that if you cut a trade too close or fail a gank, you still have more passive stacks on the way to help you regen some health and have a wicked low cooldown on your damage or movement abilities. Needless to say, another passive that mostly plays a background role. It helps you sustain through ganks and increase your chase down potential via lowering your cooldowns, without you having to do much other than, well, play the character. Like I mentioned before, it definitely comes up when you yourself are getting chased or taking an extended trade, and use the most applicable ability that you want to have back up quickly. Typically this is his first ability. Kuang dashes forward and becomes invisible, this invisibility ending after 5 seconds, or when Kuang deals damage, has damage dealt to him, or is CC'd. Kuang leaves behind a circle AoE which will detonate after 5 seconds, or by Kuang reactivating this ability, also ending his invisibility. That's a lot of moving parts there. So, for use when escaping, you usually want to detonate this AoE right away, as the ability won't go on cooldown until it's detonated. This goes from advisable to necessary when you have a passive stack available with an enemy on your back, as you get a significantly lower cooldown on your dash at your disposal if you've really got to get out of dodge. You only really want to stick around in your stealth form when you're engaging an enemy, typically when ganking or when you're escaping from a fight that you want to re-engage on. As for dashing into a fight, it's only really something you want to do early in mid-game, and even then, it has a very telltale sound effect associated with it that anyone who's played SMITE for long enough knows, so they'll be ready for you the instant they hear the dash. That said though, Lincoln to engage and you can use this ability at your feet for some decent damage as well as a nasty basic attack cancel. This is often best used with Kuang's second ability. Kuang summons 6 dragons that can be activated in 2 ways. Firstly, Kuang can basic attack while his second ability is active, and every successful basic attack, whether on a minion or a god, will make one of the 6 dragons shoot out and damage an enemy. Alternatively, Kuang can reactivate this ability and fire all remaining dragons out in a wide projectile. This projectile stopping on walls or the first enemy hit, damaging and slowing them. The damage and the slow duration scaling with the amount of dragons remaining from the initial 6. This may seem a bit overcomplicated, but really it's very simple. You activate this ability just before you reach melee range on a target and start slapping. Then, once they try to get away or begin kiting you, fire the remaining dragons. And if they take all 6, well, yeah, they probably aren't surviving. You really only want to use this if you've been forced outside of melee range, or naturally when you're trying to chase someone down. Which is actually where Ao's third ability comes in. Kuang lets loose a small fast-firing cone AoE with an extremely low cooldown. If Ao has the second ability active, any enemies hit with the third ability will have one dragon attack them in the exact way they do in their basic attack. So I'm sure by now the combos are starting to come into view for you. Ao's 3 is a small but necessary part of his combos. The extremely low cooldown is great for a bit of poke or for chase down potential, especially when they're close to execute range. Speaking of which, in Kuang's ultimate, he selects the closest god and his ultimate's very small cone radius, damaging, stunning, then knocking them up. If the targeted god is successfully knocked up and is not immune to damage, Kuang will transform into his dragon form and execute the god, getting full passive and heals for a percent of his maximum health, scaling with levels. When in his dragon form, Kuang can select a small AoE to land on at an extremely long range. Once Ao lands, he deals moderate damage to any enemies in the area. Again, a lot to unpack. So this of course is Ao's signature move. If it seemed like Ao's damage was only moderate up until now, here's why. It's not a sure thing though. As I mentioned before, if the enemy CC immunes this, whether that be through a CC immune ultimate, beads, or even an unlucky Mantle of Discord proc, you'll merely apply the small damage attached to this ability, so this can lead to another unfortunate moment with this ability. If the opponent is in execute range and this ability hits them, but then is healed in the split second between the stun and the knockup, they will not be executed. There have actually been 1 or 2 instances of people's base health regen getting them out of execute range as I'm casting this ability. No kidding. So there are a lot of risks and downsides to this ability, but as I'm sure you can guess, it's what makes AO a complete powerhouse if and when it goes off. A successful ult almost guarantees another kill for you, or at the very least very strong teamfight presence, with health and a full passive restored to you after casting. As for quote-unquote high-level mechanics, there really aren't that many. The one that springs to mind is ulting as your dragons from your second ability are still en route to the target, so that you get them in execute range and guarantee the ult. This is pretty much guaranteed to happen if your target is below 3/4 HP and has 3 or more dragons on the way to them. Other than that, there aren't really any reasons to use this ability raw for the crazy CC part other than peeling for yourself or a teammate. It certainly comes up, but only once in a while, and you really want to save it for the execute if you can. Speaking of execute, here's a few combos with AO. For leveling, you want to start with your 3, then grab your 2, then grab your 1. You can get your 1 at level 2 instead for a bit of safety. AO doesn't do much damage early anyways. From there, you can max either your 3 for a burst build or your 2 for an attack speed build, putting only 1 level into your ultimate and then skipping the leveling for last. Frankly, between the 2 and the 3, you can level whichever one feels best for you. I personally level the 3 since I like the burst and it's better for clearing camps, which AO is not great at. Whew, so there's Kuang. He has a lot of moving parts, and if you're a new player, he's probably going to be too much to wrap your head around. And even if you do, him being so lacking in the early game and frankly still not great until your second or third item makes him a beginner's nightmare as well. If you get fed early, well, you're pretty much just off to the races, holding down the basic attack and walk forward buttons in harmony. But go even, or god forbid get behind, and it takes not only great situational awareness skills as a player, but also execution on AO himself to make sure you perform optimal combos and don't overcommit. That said though, he's exceptionally rewarding to learn and flexible since you can build him more attack speed or burst oriented, fitting your personal playstyle. That's all I have on AO for now. Thanks for watching.